guys, this is Nick Silver with Guitar Genius Method. Welcome to this preview of my Guitar Genius Method course. It is something I'm really excited to share with you because I personally struggled a lot with guitar theory in the past. It's something that took me a long time to master, a lot longer than I like to admit, but uh, I realized it's not only me who have this struggle. A lot of people are struggling with guitar theory or music theory in general. Um, I see a lot of people online tend to ask the same questions over and over again. So I do see that there is a problem here. We have so much great content online nowadays uh, where you can learn, but the problem is a lot of times you just kind of choose a little bit here, a little bit there, and you really do need a structured way of learning guitar theory. So that's what I'm here to offer you with Guitar Genius Method. Not only it's a completely new way of approaching learning, because I think the problem with learning now, what we think when we think of learning, we think of a lot of repetition. It's a bit boring. You have to sit down with your books or whatever you study and just read the same thing over and over again until it sticks. But it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, you can learn something just by reading it once and commit it to memory. Same with, as I'm going to show you here, chord sequences. You can learn a large quantity of songs and then recall them with ease using these techniques. I'm not sure if you've ever been in a situation where someone found out you play guitar and they asked you to play something and you all of a sudden couldn't think of anything to play. That's pretty normal. It happens to a lot of us. Um, and the reason for that is because we usually rely on muscle memory and we don't really have a effective way of recalling information we have learned. It's kind of just floating somewhere in the back of your mind, and after a bit of fumbling around in the guitar, all of a sudden you could think of a song. But if you know exactly where you put a song, you have no problem recalling it. And not only will you recall it with ease, you will also be able to recall it many years later. Even if you haven't played the song in over years, you will still be able to recall the songs using these techniques. And these techniques are based on very advanced memorization techniques that I've learned myself, and then I've worked out a way of applying that to guitar. So it's something I did for myself, but it's something I want to share with you. So I really do hope you enjoy this. If you find it useful, or if there's anything you want to ask me, just feel free to drop a comment below. I would love to hear what you think. All right, so without further ado, let's go.
We're now going to look at how to convert chords into images. And you might be asking, why should I bother converting chords to images at all? Well, if we're going to learn a lot of songs, it's pretty easy to get things mixed up. And especially if you want to commit it to long term. Even if your muscle memory is useful to a certain degree, over time you tend to forget if you're not repeatedly playing a song. If you're not playing a song regularly, you tend to forget it. But if you have a very visual representation of that song, you will be more likely to recall the song. An added bonus of memorizing songs by using image associations is not only that you will be able to commit the songs to long-term memory and then easily recall them, you will also be able to learn songs without even picking up the guitar, meaning that you can look at a chord sequence, commit it to memory, and then at a later time play it just from memory. Your mind is very good at memorizing images. It's not very good at memorizing abstract information. That's why you usually have problem memorizing things like phone numbers or passwords. Chords can also be very hard to memorize. You usually rely solely on muscle memory, or if you have a good ear, you might be able to pick out a chord sequence by listening to the intervals between chords, or if they're minor or major chords. But if you don't have a trained ear, you usually just rely on muscle memory. So by associating chords with images, we can create a story which we then can store in our mind using the mind palaces, as I discussed before. But we're just going to focus on the process of converting chords to images for now. So we've established that your mind is very good at memorizing images, but not just any images. There needs to be something special about these images for them to stick in your mind. Let's use an example. Like if I asked you, what did you have for dinner 1 year ago at this exact day? Would you be able to tell me? Unless that was a very specific event on that day, you most likely have forgotten what you had for dinner that day. And your mind kind of works in this way every day. It prioritizes what was important on the day and then commit that to long-term memory, whereas the rest of the information will be forgotten. So there's a prioritization going on in your mind at all times. So what we need to do when we create these images is we need to make them stand out so your mind can't ignore them. And we do this through a very specific process, which I'm going to go over now. But the gist of it is that you are going to create imagery that is very strange, very, very vivid, and paradoxical. I'm now going to go over the formula with you on how to create imagery that will stick in your mind. So step 1 is to introduce a person or an object. Nothing strange so far. This person or object then needs to perform an action. This is very important. There needs to be an action. There can't just be a person standing around, and something needs to happen. And this is where we introduce a paradoxical element, because this action can't just be any action. So let's, for example, use a phone as an example. The obvious thing to do with a phone would be to make a phone call or send a text if it's a mobile phone. The less obvious thing would be to jump into the phone as if it were a swimming pool, or the phone came alive and bit off your head. That would be pretty weird, and that's what I mean with strange imagery or paradoxical events taking place in the scenes you're creating. Okay, so we now have a person and object performing an action that's strange and paradoxical. So that's basically the gist of it. So we're now going to use an example just to clarify things. So let's say we are going to memorize the chord sequence G, D, C, A minor. So let's start by going through this process and start with step 1. That would be to introduce a person or an object. So we need to associate this person, this object, with our first chord, which in this case is a G. So I've chosen to associate this with Gandhi. I have a very clear image of what Gandhi looks like. So I'm going to use Gandhi for this example. Gandhi is then going to do something in this story. So I have chosen for Gandhi to dive. So you can imagine Gandhi standing on top of a diving board, stretching, getting ready to jump off. He then jumps off, he dives off the diving board into a car. The car in this case is a paradoxical element because you wouldn't expect him to dive into a car. And as you might have guessed, the car in this case is associated with the chord C. What then happens is the car explodes. And not only does it explode to form the American flag. And in this case, I've made the association A minor, with America. So when I see the American flag, I know that is corresponds to A minor. And the explosion part as well is also a paradoxical element, because you wouldn't expect the car to explode into the shape of an American flag. So that's something that also is going to stand out in your mind. And I also want to point out something very important at this stage as well. The more vivid you can make a memory or a story, the better. Meaning, the more senses you can involve, the sounds, how things feel, even smells, the more likely it is going to stick. So if you, for example, imagine an explosion, you're not only going to visualize it, you're going to hear the explosion as well. You might also feel the debris hitting you as if you were standing in front of it, and you would feel the heat of the explosion. This is very powerful. It might sound trivial, but it does actually make a huge difference in the long run. It is important to consider when you create a memory or a story that even though it feels like you will remember it for a long time when you create it, you can't underestimate how easily you forget things. So that's why when you create these stories, you really, really need to exaggerate things. Things needs to be way bigger than they normally are. Things needs to be really strange. The stranger, the better. And not only that, you need to make the stories so strange you would be embarrassed to tell anyone about them. So this is just an introduction to the basic concept. This will make more sense once you start using this method. That's why I put strong emphasis on you doing these exercises I provided here with this video. You're not gonna get this technique just by listening to me. There's really not much to this technique other than the things I've explained. The only limitation here really is your own imagination. And some people will object here and say, I don't have a very vivid imagination, or I'm not a very creative person. But to that I say, if you practice this within a very short period of time, you will see that you will be able to create very vivid imagery, and that you are in fact more creative than you give yourself credit for. We're all very creative, really. Well, some people kind of just suppress that as they grow up, but we are all naturally very creative. So it's just something you need to practice, really. And you don't need to spend a lot of time. You don't even have to do it every day, but I would suggest at least spend a little time, at least I would say 5 times a week, just to get used to the technique. And before you know it, this technique will feel very natural to you, and you will be able to very easily memorize songs in this way, and be able to store them for a very long time. And you'll be very pleasantly surprised once you reach a certain number of songs, and you realize, wow, I know a lot of songs, and I have no problem recalling them at all.